We're delighted to have this panel, and I will turn it over to Beth. So why don't we give them a big round of applause to get them going this morning.
All right. Thanks, Jason. So it is true, I am a data junkie, in full disclosure, but like many of my panelists, and I know many of the folks in the room here, it's a shared addiction. So yesterday's plenary session and breakout sessions gave us a great look at many of the ways in which big and not so big data might help us build a smarter university. And we'll continue that discussion today. But while big data may be heralded as the new frontier, there are limitations to what this wave of information can achieve. And the cautionary side to this movement is worth exploring. In this session, the panelists will examine those issues. So last spring, our Board of Trustees adopted a data policy, committing the university to transparency and accountability. And we continue to work through that policy every day. And some of those issues are the very issues that we want our panelists to help us out with today. So we've brought our outside experts here today, and I'm going to start with a question which will allow our panelists to share a bit about themselves and help us move this discussion forward on that cautionary piece. So our panelists, Michael Chui, Rebecca Costa, and Stephen Hirdt, based on your various experiences with big data, and please share some of those, what are the most important cautions this group of higher ed leaders should be thinking about? So, Michael, would you like to start?
Sure, I'll go first. Can people hear me? Okay. So my name is Michael Chui. I'm a principal at the McKinsey Global Institute, which is McKinsey & Company's research arm. And McKinsey, you might be familiar with, is a global management consulting firm. What's kind of fun is my job, I'm sort of like a private sector professor. So I always thought I wanted to become a professor. My dad's a professor. But then as I was finishing my PhD, I realized the part of his life that I thought would be most fun is the part after he got tenure. But somehow, I ended up becoming a management consultant, and then there's this tiny little part of McKinsey where now I get to lead research on the impact of long-term technology trends for our firm. Instead of graduate students, I have McKinsey management consultants join me for research projects, and then I end up doing some speaking and writing and helping my colleagues serve clients. So one of those topics we looked at was a couple years ago. We looked at the economic potential of big data. We published a report which some people were kind enough to read and pay some attention to. And since that time, I've spent a lot of time with my colleagues and clients across a number of different industries around the world, trying to understand how you can use data to create more value. And some of that value, by the way, gets captured as profits by corporations, but some of it, we also serve public sector clients. And a lot of the value that, in fact, even our corporate clients produce, they produce even more benefits for their customers. So there's a lot of value to go around. So that being said, we outlined huge amounts of potential value. In U.S. healthcare alone, $300 to $450 billion of potential value on an annual basis. So there's a lot at stake. But you might wonder, why don't we have that yet? And so I think one of the cautionary, tales that I'd tell anyway. I have a PhD in computer science, and I think all the technical problems are difficult and hard and all those sorts of things. But I actually think that a lot of the limiting factors in our ability to capture value, to use big data effectively, are the people problems. And so I'll outline just a few of them very briefly. There's an old joke, some of you might have heard it before, because I tell it all the time, and it's not mine. But how are decisions made in most management organizations? By hippos, the highest paid person's opinion, right? We say we're all about using big data to make better decisions because we have a lot of data on the table. But when it comes time to make the decision, we look at the person at the end of the table who probably has the biggest comp package, and they say, in my last job, this worked really well, and we did it, right? And that actually isn't having the courage to to take the data seriously. It isn't, and leadership's still important in a data-driven organization, but it's asking very different questions. You know, did you conduct an experiment? Was there bias in your sample set? You know, was that correlation or causation? And so, you know, we actually think that, you know, finding people who, you know, first you need the, you know, the propeller head type folks, you know, the data scientists, but then our ranks of decision makers need to adopt a very different way of leading, managing, and making decisions. And I think that's a tremendously difficult challenge. I also joke sometimes, now that I'm in a higher education crowd, we should stop teaching so much calculus. Like, most of us have not taken an integral since we graduated. But how many of us have had to make decisions based on dirty data, you know, that wasn't quite perfect, that, you know, fields such as statistics teach us about? So I think that one cautionary tale here is that, you know, as difficult as the technology stuff is, that we need to change our mindsets, our leadership, and, you know, in some cases just our baseline level of understanding of a number of things in order to use big data more effectively.
Thank you, Michael. Steve?
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Steve Hirdt. I run a company called the Elias Sports Bureau with what's called the official statistician for the major professional sports leagues in this country, the National Football League, Major League Baseball, the National Basketball Association, which just began last night, the National Hockey League.
You have a terrible job.
Well, sometimes I get up in the morning and think that, but fortunately not too often, because our job is to be absolutely correct every day. So it's sort of like a referee or an umpire, to be absolutely correct 100% of the time and then to do better the next day. But I've done this most of my professional life, and just listen to what Michael had to say. A couple things struck me just in applications to the sports world. We've fought a different battle, and I know the topic today is big data, and we're at the just at the edge of what the explosion is going to be. It's very hard to predict what it's going to be like and what the impact is going to be in sports, but just the battles that we've fought already to get decision makers in sports to accept data as a fundamental contributor to problem solving is worth looking over. Just again briefly. I mean, I was just speaking earlier this morning about some of you in the audience. If you're from New York, you might remember the baseball manager Billy Martin, who used to be the manager of the Yankees. Kept getting hired and fired by George Steinbrenner, the owner. And Billy Martin.
Oops. Careful with your mic.
Me. Billy Martin, if anything, was an old school baseball man. You know, hard drinking, tobacco chewing, who had very set ideas on how to construct his team. Well, he kept getting hired and fired by the Yankees, and we were in the early stages of just computerizing the history of baseball. And one of the things we started to do was to develop a report that would show for a particular team how each of their pitchers has done against each of the other hitters in the league, and vice versa, how each of their hitters has done against opposing pitchers. Now, we knew that Martin would never use this, but fortunately, one of the times he was out, one of the times he had been fired, we did manage to sell it to the Yankees, and they bought it for a one-year contract. And their manager at the time, I think it was Lou Piniella, started to use it. Well, after about 2 months, the Yankees must have gone on. They must have lost 4 games in a row, so Steinbrenner fired Piniella and brought Billy Martin back. And now I thought, oh, this will be fun the rest of the season. So the first game back, they're playing against a pitcher who threw the knuckleball. Not many pitchers throw that, for those of you who don't follow it. But a very particular type of pitcher. And of course, it was written in the reports how all his batters did against it. And he chose a guy from the end of his bench, the last player on the team, put him in the lineup. I think he batted him 4th or 5th, somewhere in the lineup. And the guy got 4 hits that night off the knuckleball pitcher, Charlie Huff. So after the game, all the sports writers said, well, how did you get the idea to put this guy in? He goes, well, you know, everybody knows he hits the knuckleball pitchers well. And I thought to myself, wow, if we have Billy Martin, we really might get somewhere with this. But more often, our fights over the years, our difficulties have been in convincing people that simply because B followed A, that A did not cause B. Because in sports, it's a very linear progression toward a very immediate goal, winning the game. And anything that contributes to that, in retrospect, can be thought as being as important factor as anything else. An example from football, which has changed only very recently in its regard for this. If you look at the statistics following a game, you'll see that if a particular running back on a team gains 100 yards in a game, more often than not, his team will win. Or if the team runs more than it passes, his team will win. But when you look at the dynamics within the game, you see that the player is often accumulating those rushing yards, or the team is accumulating those rushing plays, only toward the end of the game when they're already well ahead and they're just trying to run out the clock. Nonetheless, the data doesn't tell you that unless you look at the next level of data. Well, if you break it down, how did they do in the first half? Did they achieve their lead by passing or rushing? And yet that simple principle, you have to run to win, was so ingrained in a generation of football coaches based on an early look at the data, based on just the early look that somebody said, if you run more times than you pass, your winning percentage is 75% or something like that, and they went out and did it. I often thought, why didn't they just run the ball the first 40 plays of the game and then just go home by halftime and have a sandwich? You know, they're silly. Yeah. But I think those same fits and starts that we're going to have to get through of people looking at data and coming out with kind of a wrong conclusion from a cursory look. To me, that's the real cautionary side of big data. If big data is going to amplify the possibilities for misapplication as well as the possibilities for application, I think we might be in for a little bit of a rocky road before we get to be where we want to be.
Good points. Rebecca.
I'm Rebecca Costa. I'm a sociobiologist and author. I had the privilege of being parachuted into Silicon Valley in the late 70s when the first major technology boom was underway, and Apple and Oracle and Intel were all coming into fruition. And as an evolutionary biologist, I could already see that the pace of change was going to accelerate at a rate that was not sustainable. This biological spacesuit that we're all trapped in takes millions and millions of years to develop new cognitive capabilities. And so technology was somehow going to be a good stopgap measure. It wouldn't be forever, but it would be a pretty good stopgap measure. I look at big data as a consequence of the acceleration of technology, and it was a logical consequence that we could all see coming. So it's not a decision that people make. It's just it's the next shiny technology, if you will. And it doesn't cause you to abandon other things that you're working. I wish people would look at big data more in terms of an additive technology, not as a replacement technology. And as we add more and more of these technologies, things are beginning to get really complicated. I don't know, how many of you in this room have noticed just in the last 5 years, things have gotten really, really complicated or complex? No, you gotta be honest, put your hand up. So look around the room, it's not you. It really isn't. For a long time, my son was trying to convince me I was getting old, and then he says, you know, you're just aging, you just can't keep up. And then we happened to be walking through a hotel lobby, and we got into an elevator, and there was an 18-year-old, and she had a new iPhone, and she looked at him, and she said, can you tell me how to turn the music off? And I said, no, it's not me, really. So what is complexity? Why has big data made things complex? Why has technology? Well, why has technology made things complicated? Well, according to Eric Schmidt of Google, we're generating as much data every 48 hours as we did from the dawn of humankind to year 2003, every 2 days. So now we have this giant pool of knowledge, technology, right? And Ed Wilson at Harvard University says, yeah, but we have Paleolithic emotions medieval institutions and godlike technology, you think we might have a problem? Everybody up here is going to be talking about the cultural issues of big data. If you have medieval institutions and Paleolithic emotions, and you have all the knowledge in the world, it may not produce an actionable item. You may run up against Hippo. The highest paid person's opinion overrides data, and you're all shaking your heads going, I can't believe we came out of that meeting and decided to do the wrong thing, right? And we collectively decided to do the wrong thing. So these are the issues that we're dealing with right now. And so on the cautionary side of big data, I would remind us all that we're all trapped in the same biological spacesuit. So is President Obama. So are the people that recently developed the Affordable Health Care Act wonderful site that we're all supposed to register on. It's moving at an unsustainable pace. Now, one of the definitions of complexity, which we're all dealing with, is that there are more wrong solutions than right ones. Currently, the estimate of success of big data projects that are underway, by the way, this comes from all the major suppliers like the IBMs of the world that have the Watson program up and running, is about 55% of all programs in big data are failing. We're in a high failure rate environment. The definition of complexity is that there are more wrong choices than right ones, and the number of wrong ones are exponentially growing by the picosecond. So the information technology environment that we're trying to survive in a Darwinian way is one which is a high failure rate environment. And fortunately, what I would say is that we have to try to attack big data using models that allow us to succeed despite higher failures than losses. And I frequently talk about the venture capital model. Venture capitalists are very successful, but for every 100 companies that they do diligence on, they only expect 10 or 15 to do well. And yet, those successes far overwhelm the losses. But when it comes to technology, we tend to argue and argue and argue till we come down to that one elixir, that one thing. Big data is going to solve everything. And it never works out that way. And anybody who's running an IT department knows that you haven't been able to abandon anything. It just keeps getting piled on and piled on and piled on. So we have to look at strategies that are adapted to high failure rate environments when it comes to solutions or IT, and in particular with big data. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, I'm sure, later.
Okay, great. Steve, coming from higher ed where there isn't as large a fan base as there is around sports data. You're taking issue with that, Mark?
I don't know. People spend a lot of Saturdays watching a lot of college sports, and now increasingly during the weekdays too.
Oh, well, I'm fitting that under sports.
Okay,
sorry.
all right.
I'm thinking about the big fan base around graduation rates and research and development. Anyway, so Steve, it occurs to me that you really are in a fishbowl with millions of people checking your data analysis. And that, I think maybe there are some lessons learned because we're in a new age in higher education where folks are starting to peel the layers back, look at the data. We have a lot more consumerism today. People are holding us accountable. I think we can learn a lot from you. I imagine, well, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I guess this microphone had not been working.
Now.
You okay now?
Sounds good, yeah.
I think this was last used by Sinatra at the Sands or something like that.
I wasn't there.
Thanks for
if you want to snap your fingers, it's
no,
okay.
no, that's okay. Thanks for rubbing it in about the need to be right and everything. But actually, we embrace the challenge to be right. I joked about it earlier. It's actually one of the things that differentiates us from, the 5,000 kids here who probably have a database in New York City and are writing Tom Coughlin on how to make the Giants better this year or something like that. But our history of it was that we had first to digitize all of the information, which we had accumulated on paper over the years, which was a tremendous proposition in itself, so that we could call on it and without hesitation know that it's accurate. And boy, am I glad that we did that, because it reduces the worry that when something happens at 11 o'clock at night and we're saying this is the first time this has ever happened, I can go to sleep that night. I can say, okay, I think we might have that nailed. My looking at the problem, though, is one where sometimes I keep going back to the old axiom that a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, and how can we get to the spot of greater knowledge without working through the fits and starts? Is that a necessary component to get there? Sometimes you see things that happen in a game where a decision has to be made immediately. Now, there's two types of decision makers in sports. There are the general managers in professional sports. The general managers, or in college sports, the recruiters, who generally recruit the athletes to play on the team or scout them. And then there are the in-game decision makers, such as the head coach, or in baseball terms, the manager, who deploy the athletes and concoct the strategy with which to try to win the game. There's an increasing tension between those two jobs. It's rare. Occasionally there's one individual who holds both jobs. And Bill Parcells, I think, the football coach, was the guy who was in charge of coaching once, but he wasn't getting the athletes, and it got under his skin. His way of putting it was, if they want you to cook the meal, they should let you shop for the groceries, don't you think? And but that tension, which I don't think would be unique to sports, I would imagine that applies throughout a lot of different areas of industry and academia. It's one in which, despite the group of players that might be acquired to perform, if they are not put in those roles by the guy making the decisions on the field, that guy is either better be successful or he's going to be unemployed very soon. You saw the movie Moneyball, probably, which, as I said earlier this morning, was kind of a cartoonish version of the actual decision-making process and the actual success of that team. But it did highlight the fact that the guy who was ultimately charged with deploying the athletes, the manager in the film, I think he's played by Philip Seymour Hoffman, he was kind of at odds with the guy who procured the talent in the front office, the general manager, played by Brad Pitt, and that they had to sort of drag him along. Now that's probably an extreme example, because the film itself, as I say, was not exactly true to every fact, but an exposure to a little bit of knowledge can sometimes lead you down the wrong path. And also, in that regard, at least in sports, sometimes now the decision makers on the field are aware of some sort of statistic or fact which, in a general sense, is ascribed to a certain situation. Here's a perfect example. With a man on, I'm sorry to be too baseball specific here. If you're not a fan, I'll try to be brief. But if there's a man on first base and nobody out, and it's an important part of the game, should you give up an out to move that guy to second? Should you use a sacrifice bunt to move that runner to second base? You'll now have a man on second base with one out. Do you get more runs in an inning if there's a man on first base and nobody out, or a man on second base and one out? Basic question and a mathematical one. Studies have been done, and it shows that, yes, by a very small increment, you get more runs per inning with a man on first base and nobody out than if you sacrifice and get him on second with one out. Now, that is the average. That averages all the innings from all the games in all the circumstances over a 10 or 15-year period. But when you take it to nobody ever faces an average situation.
Right.
They face a specific situation in which the circumstances that are immediately in front of you are brought to bear on your decision. Now, it's good to know what the average is, so you can use it as a guidepost. And I saw the Mets, the last time they were in the playoffs, get eliminated in the final game because of a misapplication, in my mind, of this principle. They were 2 runs down. They had runners on first and second in the bottom of the 9th inning, nobody out. And rather than bunt to move them along to second and third, with a pair of 300 hitters coming up next, they decided to play the inning straight away and have the guy swing, and they wound up not scoring. I always thought that was a case of a misapplication of that very small principle, the very tiny difference between man on first, nobody out, and man on second, 1 out, and one which was overwhelmed by the circumstances of the immediate here. The guy you would be bunting with was the worst hitter in the lineup. The 2 guys coming up next with 300 hitters at the top of the lineup. And those things gave you a better chance to succeed. Plus, in the bottom of the 9th, if you're 2 runs down, you can't even get 8 runs in an inning. You're not going to play for a big inning in the bottom of the 9th. All you needed was 2 to tie, 3 to win. It always stuck with me that the specific sometimes can overwhelm the average, the overall average. But are people predisposed to think in terms of, well, I'll cover myself by staying with the average here. I don't want to have to make a seat-of-the-pants decision here because it exposes me as a decision maker for going against what I believe the data should determine. I think that would be a bad thing generally in life if everything were determined by application of data to every situation. Mm-hmm. The trick is to make the data so good that with more study, it can get to the point where you can increase your chances of success, not just to winning a baseball game, but deciding where a hospital is going to be built or building a new subway line, the more you study the data. So I don't know if that answers your question. But
That's really interesting. I think a lot of advice, a lot of application to higher education, but I'm curious what our other panelists think, and if you want to amplify. Michael, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, a few thoughts. I think one of the questions that's come up in the discussion is around data quality and making sure that there aren't errors in the data, or it's as accurate as possible, because everyone's looking at it, and increasingly people are looking at data that's coming out of higher education, not just college sports. A couple of points. I think one thing that we've discovered is that more often than not, people over-specify for data quality. We have a lot of companies that we talk to where the most experienced data people in the organization are the finance people. And they have a 0 defect requirement, right? You cannot ship somebody a bank statement with an error in it. That's unacceptable. But it turns out for lots of other uses of data, you don't need 100% perfect data. And so waiting until you make that data completely perfect before starting to use it often is the wrong move to make. And so just matching the requirements for what you're going to use the data for to the data quality, I think is important, right? I mean, I think, even if we didn't have perfect Elias Sports Bureau data, which I believe we generally do, I think baseball managers would still use some, would still get some reasonable benefit out of it. So I think understanding data quality doesn't have to be perfect before you can start to use it. The other point that I'd make is, we just published this report. You can download off the web yesterday. On the potential impact of open data. So what happens when you make data available in machine-readable forms to third parties? People pay, but the Sports Bureau has that option. What we discovered was not only does it enhance big data, right? You multiply the number of people and then multiply the amount of data, you can usually do more things. But there's an old saying from open source software, for those of you who are software geeks, right? It's Eric S. Raymond used to say, with enough eyeballs, all bugs in the software are shallow, right? You eventually find them. We think an almost similar corollary is true of data. If you make data open, you make it more liquid, we sometimes describe it, then you have more people looking at it, then data quality tends to increase. Not only because people are, don't want to be embarrassed, but also because with more people looking at the data, they're more likely to find errors to be able to correct it. In fact, we also talked about a different type of data we describe as my data. So that might be providing, performance data to a student about themselves. So it's an organization providing data to a person about whom the data is provided. There's nobody who has more incentive to make sure that my academic data, that my healthcare data is accurate than I am. So again, providing me with that data can be a powerful way to actually increase data quality. So there are a number of ways to increase data quality, which might be a little bit counterintuitive. But I think the other thing to remember is you don't need 100% data quality before you can start to use it. In fact, it's probably a mistake not to start using it sooner rather than later.
So the upside of the fishbowl. So Rebecca, what about you?
From my perspective, I just want to back up for a moment and try to look at the really big picture, which is, why are we collecting this data? What is the whole point of it? And in reality, it's risk reduction. It's to reduce the risk of our decisions, and because that will improve our probability of success. So we may have started out with pieces of paper that said this batter to this pitcher, is probably the best possible match. And then we moved on to much more sophisticated algorithms. Now we're moving on to systems like Watson that can search the entire universe of medical data and in a picosecond produce the highest to the lowest probability of a patient's diagnosis in an ER. So in just our lifetime, when you think about it, that is this big step. So where does it go from here? Well, where it goes is a really scary place. I just came back from a medical conference watching a demonstration of facial recognition software coming to a neighborhood near you in a nanosecond, by the way. Because today, for a doctor to administer pain medication, they come into your room and they say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much pain are you in? I go, I don't know, 4, 9? What's 1 to 10? So, but the way that we humans express pleasure, pain, is through our face. So now through facial recognition software, we could monitor every patient, and in advance of them being in pain and ringing that annoying buzzer, we can come in with the appropriate amount of medication. Now we were talking earlier about sports. Now imagine facial recognition software on every player, live during a game, reporting back what the player's going to do next. He says it wrecks sports. He was unhappy about this. He doesn't want, but this is kind of where we're going. We're going where we're talking about big data. I'm talking about bigger data. Imagine having your cell phone, right? Which can look back at you now. Everybody understands this, right? When your eyes go off the cell phone, it shuts off. Now it's looking back at you. So I came back from the National Retail Federation, which are the CIOs and CTOs of Neiman Marcus, Macy's, all of those guys. I mean, forget the NSA and surveillance. Consumer surveillance is... I'm so much more afraid of consumer surveillance than any metadata the NSA is collecting. Let's not even go there. But they have programs now where as you're going through their catalog and you see a sweater, they can monitor your face and go, I hate that. That's just awful. Oh, this one's great. Now they're going to send you an offer, 10% off. Are you kidding me? I'm not buying that for 10% off. Now I'm going to come back with a 20% offer. Now they know the color you like, the style you like, through facial recognition software. Every decision you make. This is the mother of all data. I used to think, I work with Dole Fresh Foods on big data applications in agriculture, which everyone thinks agriculture is a sleepy industry, but agricultural facilities now look like pharmaceutical environments. I mean, they're into microbiology and all kinds of things that just 20 years ago, they were just putting a seed in the ground and watering it and harvesting. None of this microbiology stuff. So talk about big data. They're overwhelmed. Dole Fresh Foods is the largest provider of food in the world, and they have hillsides in Guatemala where the humidity changes at the top of the hill by 1%, different than the bottom of the hill, and that's going to determine their crop yield and their profitability. And so what they need is a farmer to have a mobile phone to say, hey, my 1% humidity just changed at the top of the hill, what should I do? And they need Watson to feed back, hey, start a 1% calcium drip so that the fruit doesn't get soft and doesn't get bruised by the time it gets to your and my grocery store, and your yield and profitability go down. So just to prepare us for where big data is going, the cautionary side of big data, we're at the earliest, most primitive steps. Mega data is coming our way in the form of facial recognition software, mobile apps that are going to allow us to make decisions in real time. And now let me balance that against what Ed Wilson says, those Paleolithic emotions, those medieval institutions that are kind of scary, I think. So that's my take on it.
Interesting. Steve looks disconcerted.
Well, no, I just have a...
He is. Because you're ranking sports.
We're all looking
No, my
disconcerted.
question had nothing to do with sports. No, a decision a football coach makes of something is my... But I'm just thinking in terms of, and I'm just as an outsider, thinking of the foods that when I was young we were told to eat dairy, eat butter, eat eggs, eat whole milk, all that stuff. And I'm sure that was done based on the best evidence available. Now we've come years since then, and opinion on that has changed. If you increase the amount of data going into the original opinion, I think the point I brought up earlier was based along the lines, Michael, of are we going to have to go through a slog of misinformation before we get where we want to be in terms of getting everything right? And because the amount of data is going to be much larger and the impact of the data being collected is going to touch so many more elements of our lives, is the potential for misuse greater than in just telling me for the first 20 years of my life I should have scrambled eggs for breakfast every day.
You know, it's funny. I've often said it's using data or not using data doesn't equate to being good or bad. It's important to use data. It's also really important to be good at it. The financial industry used a lot of data, had very sophisticated algorithms, but messed it up. And I don't fault the use of data. I fault the way they use the data. Right? So a number of different assumptions about the time windows in which they specified parameters, et cetera. And so there is some art to it, and there are varying scales of how good you can be at using data. Just as in sports, just as in retailing and everything else. And so, again, I think it's important to say, not just to say you need to use data, but you need to use it well. And well is a spectrum. You can learn how to do it, but a lot of it requires apprenticeship. A lot of it does require formal training. But in order to figure out how to use it in business, how to use it in higher education, et cetera, the practice of using it actually is really important. And what we find in a competitive situation, with companies competing against each other, it's not that I learned how to use data and now I'm always ahead of my competition. It's a run faster business. And again, tons of sports analogies come, right? But you learn how to do it, the other people try to catch up with you, et cetera. And so it's not something you can rest on your laurels and say, we got that covered. You need to continually invest and get better at it.
So, Michael, building on the comments you've made around that, yesterday our keynote speaker talked about big data becoming a very frightening term for many. So how do we differentiate between the reality there and the rhetoric? And what guidance can you offer?
So that's
our
partly my
ed
fault.
leaders? It's your fault, totally.
No, I mean, first of all, this term big data, it's branding to a certain extent, and now there's a firm called Gartner's talked about a hype cycle where you reach a trough of delusionment, and there's all this backlash because it didn't deliver as quickly as you thought it would, et cetera. And by the way, big just talks about the volume of data, but it's also the increasing diversity of types and sources. It's increasingly real-time nature. There's a whole bunch of things about the complexity of data that we just use the adjective big to capture. But the truth is, I think as we mentioned before, this is going to take years. This is just really just the beginning of a journey in terms of learning how to use data better. Both the technical problems as well as these problems about how we adjust or manage our Paleolithic emotions, et cetera. So, again, in terms of disambiguating the hype from what's real, again, requires a deep understanding. It requires all of us to train ourselves, to educate ourselves, to apprentice ourselves in order to really understand what's possible now, what might be possible in the future, what is a good, effective use of data. And again, not a binary way. Did we do it better? Can we do it better? Those are the kinds of things that we're going to have to learn, and hopefully, education will help us along that way.
So do you want to elaborate a little bit on the skill set that you think is needed,
Yeah.
the ideal skill set?
Yeah. Well, again, I think it depends on the role. We broke it down into at least two broad categories. There will be some people who are data specialists. The sexy new job title nowadays, if you looked on LinkedIn, is data scientist. These are people with advanced training in machine learning, which is a branch of artificial intelligence or computer science, and statistics, right? So master's level or above, plus an understanding of whatever domain they're trying to solve problems in, whether it's business, content expertise, exactly. So there are a set of folks, in our analysis, in our research, we said, look, in the United States alone, if you look at current course and speed from a couple of years ago, now things have changed, right? SUNY and lots of other schools now are starting to educate more people, but at the time, between current course and speed in terms of the number of people who were graduating, immigrating, et cetera, against a demand curve based on a big data economy, by 2018, we'd have a shortfall of 140 to 190,000 positions for these highest level of analysts, these data scientists, people who can design experiments, do analysis, et cetera. Now, we think, the market's going to clear. Educational institutions are catching up, et cetera. But, that's a set of skills which is important for those folks. But the other group of people that we thought we had to figure out a need for is, broadly speaking, decision makers. So call them broadly executives, managers, analysts, maybe department heads, provosts, I don't know. And for those people, we didn't necessarily think they had to have advanced training in machine learning, right? We did not necessarily have to program artificial intelligence algorithms, but have enough understanding of statistics, have just a modicum of understanding of computer science, so that they could be good consumers of big data analysis. And so be able to ask the right questions, to be able to challenge people who are providing analyses, to be able to have that different type of management dialogue that I talked about before, being able to the difference between correlation and causation, and to push on whether or not that was correlation or causation when you see data presented. And those are more basic skills, but I think incredibly important skills. And those can be learned in a semester or less even. But assuming a certain level of numeracy. Yeah.
And what about the communication piece?
It's huge. Just like any other decision-making discipline, unless people change their behavior, unless they move, you haven't had impact. And so, there are different ways to do it. You can describe it as communication. You can describe it as storytelling. Other people specialize in visualization or providing things in a graphical manner that convince people. But that ability to, make your decisions have impact is incredibly important as well. Now, one interesting thing is, not all of those skills often exist in the same body.
Right.
So teams are important too.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Rebecca, you talked a little bit about generational differences and the appetite and comfort level with data, and also success and failure. What advice do you have for this crowd as we're bringing along a whole new generation? What do you elaborate a little bit more on those differences generationally and what that means for higher ed, professors, students?
Well, I'll just give an example. I'm sort of my own test case all the time. I recently went into a giant mega electronics store, And there were so much software and hardware, I mean, lots of cool stuff, and I walked up and down the aisle, and then I started to leave. There wasn't anything I needed. And then I got to my car and I said, no, it's a huge store. There has to be something in there I need, because otherwise I'm going to be my grandmother who says, I don't need a cell phone. What do I need a cell phone for? Because that's where we're all headed. So I turned around from my car. I was really brave. I turned around and I went back into the store. You guys are nodding your head. You've done this. I went up and down. I said, I cannot leave the store until I buy something. I'm going to make myself buy something. I'm going to take it home, and I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to figure out why I need this. I don't know why I need it. There's a whole group of us that are getting older, and we don't even understand why anyone's tweeting. Why does anyone need to know? I'm having coffee at the SUNY conference. We're irrelevant. I was at a national healthcare conference where the host of it was so courageous. She got up and she said, I have a confession to make. I've never tweeted. Right. I've never tweeted. And I thought it was just like a really brave kid. I felt like it was an AA meeting.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yay. Really. So there's a point at which we all have to get real. Real about what's happening right now. It's a massive transformation. I call it the Technolithic era. We're going through, soon we'll look like the Bronze Age. We'll look like the Stone Age. We'll look like we picked up cell phones and tried to use them as hammers. I mean, we're going to look very primitive at this point in time. And this is the perspective that we should all have so that we can take this stress off our backs and realize that human evolution is this massive continuum, and we're just in this really messy space. We don't like messy. We don't do messy very well. We want it all to be, okay, it's all done, this is the way to do it. But we must understand that in nature, any drive towards singularity is a drive toward extinction. Mm-hmm. If you take nothing away from me, take that one thing. When you try to drive toward a singular solution, you're driving toward extinction. You're like an animal who's decided to only eat one food or who can only adapt to one climate. And so the insurance in nature against a high failure rate environment is diversification. Now, everyone in here understands it when it comes to their retirement portfolio, but we don't necessarily apply it to big data. Mm-hmm. We want, like, the answer. Somebody come in and fix my IT problem, and here's the answer, and then here's the rule, and then here's what to do when the big data program spits out the rule. And it's messy. And we're just starting out on it, and it's difficult. So if you were to ask me from a smarter university, because that's what this conference is about, from a smarter university perspective, this is what I would say. The biggest challenge I think we have is content loading, and I'm not talking about computers. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about there's too much data, and we're having trouble cognitively loading content in order to be good executives and good stewards of that information. And this is where I think neuroscience plays a tremendous role, because it's the first time in human history that we've been able to look under the skull and see what happens when we're in overload. And when Eric Schmidt from Google tells you you're on overload, you're on overload, right? I don't feel bad about it anymore. I did for a while, but not anymore. And so now what I realize is I've got to load content, and we now know that the brain itself wants to be warmed up before it learns. It goes into a mode of learning to learn. And so we're not going to have enough time to talk about this, but I believe that the breakthroughs that we're going to have in neuroscience, we have now the administration funding a new brain science project. It's the country, it's the university, it's the group who unlocks how the human brain processes, loads information, and makes fast decisions in a mission-critical environment that has the greatest competitive edge economically. Let there be no doubt. It is a cognitive issue that we're up against right now. Mm-hmm. And it's whoever solves that and figures out how to facilitate those decisions how to increase our odds of being able to preempt. Because the reason we are at the top of the, a lot of you forgot your evolutionary classes. You moved on and went, who cares about human evolution? But the reason that we're at the top of the pyramid is that there is no organism that can do thought experiments, take data, and run scenarios, prioritize those scenarios, pick out the one that's most likely in our brains, and then make an action in the present to circumvent a negative outcome. And how many of you think we've squandered that? How often do we use it? It is the greatest evolutionary asset that has ever been developed on any living organism. So this is what the data is good for. The data is good because it allows us to make better projections, to be better predictive organisms, and then to act in the present, fashion those into something that's actionable, that will reduce negative outcomes and increase positive ones. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. It makes me think, Steve, of your case, that decision, run, bunt. It's not the average, it's the special case. It's using all that information in the unique situation. There's a very strong linkage here. So these have been great comments, and I'm so appreciative to the panelists. I think we can open this up now to the group, and let's get more discussion going with our higher ed folks so that they can pick your brains on the particular areas they're interested in exploring. So I think we have 2 microphones set up on either side. It's not easy for me to see the room, but I'm going to count on the microphone holders to help me out here. Questions? We've got one right down here in the front. I think it's Bill Durgan. Please identify yourself and where you're from.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Bill Durgan from SUNY Institute of Technology. It strikes me that given access to the same data, different experts can come up with different answers. In specific, I'd like to ask you about Nate Silver in the last presidential election. And everybody, all the analysts had access to the same big data for that election. Yet Nate got it right. Why?
He didn't do so well in football.
He did go 50 for 50 on the states.
That's true.
And DC. But I think he's been very humble, and a part of him a little territorial about the reasons for why. He hasn't explained, nor is he under any order or compunction to explain the specific nature of his data sorting routines and programs that allowed him to make those predictions. I know it really stirred the pot for the, what do they call it, the puntitocracy in the country, because a lot of times his, not only in the 2012 election, but in the 2008 election, he was ahead of everybody. He did cut his teeth on analyzing sports statistics, and I believe he's returned there, and I think he's just rejoined the sports fraternity, joining ESPN, and I think he'll be heard from after the new year. I don't think anyone knows the specific reasons, but just in general, sitting from where I sit, I would say he just analyzed the data better than anybody else. I don't know better than anybody else. Maybe there were others out there who went 50 for 50. The way our politics are now, just as an aside, and anybody sitting here probably could have gone 46 for 50, just knowing if you're a red state or a blue state. Probably very few states in play. But I think he probably did a better job of analyzing it, to your point, that people can look at the same information, can come out with different decisions. Anybody have a better reason than that?
I'd like to answer it in terms of the fact that I think the latest statistic is 95% of data is unstructured. And by unstructured, I love when the computer industry says unstructured. They mean unusable. Because, let's speak real English here. if it's unstructured, you can't get to it. You can't organize it, and you can't translate it into anything actionable. So if 95% of the data is unstructured and only 5% is structured, then any predictions you're making are hypotheses that are pushed up against 5% of data, and within that 5% of data, it may be valid or invalid. There might be a lot of junk science in there as well, correlations instead of valid science. So I would say that's an area where you're going to have extremely high rates of failure, right? And I can't explain exactly what Nate's secret formula is, other than he's Nate, he's got a great brain, and he may be picking up on subtleties, which we're very good at. I mean, look, some of you are better at picking up subtleties than others, and you may be descendants of those people. Most of you are in the room today because you were very good, your ancestors were great liar detectors. I mean, you notice someone's got a little bit of moisture over the top of their lip, and you go, I don't believe that guy. Well, you don't know why you don't believe them. Maybe you go, well, I'm going to let him go down the road a little bit, and then you say, oh my gosh, I knew it all along. I knew it the first moment I met them. So you have these instincts, and some people are very good and skilled at picking up subtleties, and others aren't. And it may very well be that Nate can read between the lines, But at 5% data, don't feel bad if your forecast is wrong.
Can I add a few things? I don't think unstructured data is unusable data.
Yeah, it is.
Turns out people are getting better at figuring out how to use
unstructured data.
But if you
can't access it, what are you going to do with it?
Potentially usable, so that's fair. A couple other things. I do think, the Nate Silver or analytics folks versus pundits is one of those hippos versus a new way of making decisions type. So I think that's a huge lesson from all that. As bad as he made mistakes in football, it's still interesting. And I think the two other things about that story. One is, my point earlier about you can be better or worse at using the data. Some people are really going to be better at it, and so again, other people use data, and some people are going to be better at making decisions. And so that's important, and trying to learn how you do that. I think one of the techniques that comes to the fore out of that lesson is that, just like a lot of scientists, he was doing a meta-study, right? As opposed to just taking poll data from one source, right? Which some pollsters, if I'm one pollster, I will talk about, the results from my poll. If you actually combine data from multiple sources, right? That's another lesson from open data. Then you can often, derive better results. And I think that's an important skill, to be able to integrate data from multiple sources in order to come to better results. And that's at least one of the things that he does.
Great. Okay, do we have another question? Okay.
Ron Sarner, SUNY IT. Strikes me that one thing missing in this discussion is that the work that's being done, the analyses that are being done, ultimately is probabilistic, not deterministic. And that when we go from looking at big data to an individual case, we can't with certainty say in the abstract or in the collectivity, X follows Y, but that still is probabilistic, and in a particular case, and certainly in the sports example, it's not going to hold up in every case. And if we view it through the prism that we are looking at models which are inherently deterministic, we set ourselves up to fail. And certainly in individual cases we do.
It's a good lesson for life.
Absolutely.
Right? Which I mean, that's a joke, but I mean, that is the difference about viewing the world through a statistical lens versus these other models. And the world actually is that way. So I think it's actually good to be able to internalize that, because we don't naturally internalize that lesson very easily because of our biology.
Other comments? Steve?
I agree. It is based on probabilities, but that is the I don't know of anything that would be based on an absolute guarantee. Well, maybe there probably are some things, but I think
That would be death and
increasing your
taxes.
chances for success is what the study of data is all about. Increasing your chances to make a correct decision, increasing your chances to have better health, better nutrition. I don't think that it's, there are going to be wrong decisions along the way, and the thing is to try to come up with better data and better analysis of it to make those better decisions.
I agree. We're not saying that statistics are going to be deterministic and that we're abandoning free will. In Greek mythology, the Moira, right, which were the angel-like beings that were in charge of fate, and what was interesting about them is that they didn't determine what men and women would do. They only determined what the consequences of those choices would be. But the choices were ours. We got to roam the earth and have free will. However, depending on what we picked, they decided the consequences. And I always liked that model very well because it makes an accommodation for what will happen if you choose these things and your own ability to decide. And we don't know, right? That's why we call it the future, because there's no facts about the future. It hasn't happened yet.
Good point. Okay, we have one over here.
Harvey Stenger, Binghamton University. The last couple of days we've been talking a lot about how data can be used to predict a consumer's behavior or can influence a consumer's behavior. But we're trying to solve, or we're trying to influence an 18 to 19-year-old's educational behavior. And I'm wondering whether the lessons we're learning from consumer behavior are going to be able to apply to educational behavior. And in your cases or your other things you've looked at, do you see when you're trying to extrapolate from consumer behavior to some other kind of behavior that fails miserably because people don't use the same kind of motivations when they're trying to better their life rather than better their next purchase? Does that sort of make sense?
I'll use facial recognition software as an example. I think facial recognition software on every student as they're taking tests, as they're learning, would be phenomenal information to have. I know. See, I really, a lot of times I come to these conferences and people just freak out and say thanks, but no, don't ever come back again. All right? Because you're scaring us. You're scaring us. But just imagine for a moment that you had that data in real time on every student. So someone's up there lecturing, and through their facial expression, you're realizing that 25% of the students, you've got a little thing in the background that says, hey, 25% of your students aren't getting what you're talking about. I'm getting real-time feedback as an instructor based on how many students really understood the lesson that I just gave them. And then I go, wait a minute, a quarter of you didn't understand what I said. Let me go back. Let me present it a different way. Just imagine that real-time feedback. That's huge. That's coming. I mean, I've been so off on my predictions. It's unbelievable. I don't even predict anymore. I thought 3D printing was like, I estimated 3 years out, and then now they're making plastic toys, with a $6,500 printer this year. So my timetables are off, but the actual things that are happening very, very quickly. And that is really where education could go, with a combination of neuroscience to be able to understand how the brain makes decisions. That's coming out of the consumer industry as well. And a lot of these things, I think, can be repurposed. Sometimes we don't like to go to another industry to borrow a model because we have just a distaste for it. Maybe we don't see that there's a relationship between what the consumer industry is doing, but that facial recognition software is an example. I just want to give another example of looking outside your industry. When Dole Fresh Foods first brought me on, a sociobiologist, why am I working with their board of directors? You would think there's what would be the point there? They were looking for models which would help them adjust to the radical changes in their industry. And I'm a big believer that if you analyze what business you're in correctly, it will lead you to the most unlikely industry. And in Dole Fresh Foods' case, the model that they needed to adapt was the ER. The minute that I could go to them and say, you have vegetables that are dying, They're dying. And you're trying to get them to the grocery store before they're dead, or you make no money. So what we have is you need to go adopt the techniques, the language, and everything from an emergency room. And the first time that we met, they shook their head and they said, we know you're an out-of-the-box thinker, but we didn't know you were a wackadoodle. We thought we were paying an innovator instead, right? But now the language inside Adult Fresh Foods is completely different. They're adopting the technologies that fit from the ER room, and those that don't, they have to make that discernment, if you will. But I can see a lot of things happening in the consumer world that are completely transposable. Now, to your point, the consumer world is driven by bottom line economics. And that's not ever going, that model is never going to work in education. The cost per student, per unit of education and all that, some things just don't work in an economic model. It's good to have them as guidelines, but at the end of the day, an educated population is just flat out good for society. It's just a good thing. And sometimes, you know, you can't jam everything into that one model. Sometimes we have to elevate and say it's the right thing to do, you know, and step out of that.
Can I build on some of your points, Rebecca? And you know, feel free to get out the pitchforks later. I'm going to say some provocative things, maybe. But in terms of learning from other industries, there are 3 sectors in the economy which have not benefited from the use of technology, from the use of data to the extent that the rest of the economy have. They are public sector, healthcare, and education. And I think there's a lot that those 3 sectors can learn from, you know, those capitalist pigs in business. I do think that marketing and behavioral economics and all those disciplines, you know, which are used to serve the almighty bottom line in business, those techniques can be used in education. So my friends at Khan Academy, for instance, are looking at things like, you know, if you teach trigonometry first or you teach algebra first, you know, what provides better outcomes in calculus? You know, following those web trails are exactly the same sorts of things to figure out whether or not somebody wants to buy a coat or a scarf and whether or not that ends up, you know, having them buy in the future. So I do think some of those analytic techniques are helpful. I think similarly, analytic techniques about how can you improve the performance of managers by measuring their performance, understanding what interventions are going to increase their performance. Gosh, why aren't we treating teachers as professionals in the same way? I know it's painful and irritating and annoying, but why aren't we measuring performance and figuring out how to manage people so they actually provide better educational outcomes for our students, which is what we want? And I do think we need to measure the costs of education. I'm not saying we need to, just like I don't think all of the businesses we advise, the only thing you need to do is take cost out, because productivity is a ratio. There's quality on the numerator and there's cost in the denominator. Yeah, you got to think about, can you take cost out of the denominator, but can you improve the quality? I think the same thing's true in education. Can we be more efficient in education, but can we also provide better educational outcomes, thinking about both parts of that equation? So I think there's a lot of things that we can apply from the business world in education. I don't think everything, but you know, some of those principles, some of those techniques I think are completely applicable, and we should.
Do we have time for one more, Jason? Yeah. Okay. Oh, okay, I thought we had
Hello. Angel Andrew from Monroe Community College in Rochester. The cautionary tale so far you folks have spoken about are basic just caution for any kind of data in Stats 101. When I hear big data, I'm really thinking when you're connecting different databases together. When you want to connect databases from government sources, consumer sources together, which adds certain threats. And just as hospitals had bioethicists, I was wondering the idea of having data ethicists. Just because you can connect data together, should you be connecting data together? Imagine a system, not SUNY, out somewhere in the West, who wants to connect databases with the government and private industries to understand students better, to serve students. That's fine. Take it a step further. Now this system, not SUNY, out west somewhere, now realizes their swirl and their employees are doing certain things they wish to understand to improve productivity or whatever. So now they start connecting the databases of their system to Department of Labor, federal taxation, to understand what's going on with the employees. So just because we can connect databases together, should we? Just because we can collect certain data, should we? Or should we at least question prior to actually doing? Just like before we develop medical procedures, eventually we may do heart transplants. When it first was done in 1960s, question, should we do it? Well, yeah, now we do it. We've asked that ethical question. Should we be asking ethical questions about data before just jumping in and collecting all this data? Thank you.
So the quick answer is yes. I do think we should be considering ethics, morals, why are we doing what we should be doing? So I think the overall answer is yes. And it's funny, given the cautionary tale, we haven't really talked about privacy and confidentiality yet, and it's huge, and it's complicated and difficult and many other things. I do think, and by the way, you do get more value when you connect data together. I do think there's an interesting idea. Dana Boyd at Microsoft Research is at least the person that I heard it from, which is that it is becoming increasingly difficult to regulate or try to restrict or constrain either the generation or collection of data, and sometimes the combination of data. It's just very difficult to do because we've sometimes described it as exhaust data. You can't, I walk around with a cell phone, it just throws off data. I can't help it unless I turn the thing off. Right? But then I don't get to use it at all. If I drive my car, it's a car is a computer network on wheels. So data just gets generated. But another perspective is, rather than trying to regulate the collection of data or the generation of data, we should regulate its use, because oftentimes that's actually what we find objectionable. That you use the data to do this to me or around me, et cetera. And so I think that's a policy framework that's worth thinking about. We know, for example, that HIPAA, the Health Information Privacy Act, has restricted medical researchers from doing extremely important and what would be effective medical research. Which again, I think if we were regulating the use of the data, right? I'm not sure that we would want to regulate away that use of the data versus the collection of the data, that we might come out with a better outcome. So there's at least a thought about a policy, a different way of thinking about policy that maybe we could get at some of those issues around privacy.
Well, it just strikes me that the question seems to be fraught with political overtones, especially in a society where it would be so easy for a political candidate to rail against the collection of the data. The example that you gave of Eric Schmidt saying we're on the verge of overload of processing what we have. Well, he's got it all. I mean, he's a guy who, he's got it. We don't. The government has it. We don't. I think the question is more of a political one, even than an ethical one, because there are going to be cases where people run for office. I could see with this as one of their issues. It'll be an appeal to voters to restrict the use of new data in a sense that would more be an appeal for their vote than a reason to not collect it for any other reason. Just as a simple and effective way to say, hey, here's what I stand for. Let's go back to not collecting all this data.
I would just add to that there's no question that the complexity and the amount of data that we have is establishing a new predatory environment. And by that I mean that those who have the resources and the ability to construct predictive algorithms, accurate predictive algorithms, are going to have the upper hand. And those who don't will fall victim to that. They'll be taken advantage of. That's how we're still wired. Those are those Paleolithic emotions. And I am very concerned about that, because as we know, our privacy is being violated and more data is being collected, and that data is being analyzed. Like I said, the consumer sector to me seems way ahead of the government and everybody else. their techniques and technology and their analysis as well. But I do worry that for those who can't overcome the complexity, not just of the data, but also just of society, as an example, and we don't want to get political here on the stage, but you know, since we've opened that door, our tax code here in the United States is about 75,000 pages right now. It used to be 400, which allows a company like General Electric, right, to hire buildings and buildings of tax accountants and lawyers to go through that 75,000 pages and perfectly legally, doing nothing wrong, pay no taxes. Whereas the person on the street who's self-filing is paying the maximum amount, right? So it's the complexity, I believe, of massive amounts of data, the algorithms, the predictive accuracy that's going to give the competitive edge. And we talked about that earlier on. And that does border on an ethical issue, right? I mean, how much predatory practice are we going to permit to happen? And where are the new laws that are going to come in to prevent that data from being misused or abused? And frankly, that's the story of any technology, right? I mean, at any time we make an advance, we have to deal with the human repercussions of that advance.
So we're left with a problem and not an answer here. But so, Michael, just from your experience, I wonder what advice do you offer around this for higher ed leaders? I mean, it's an ethical issue. There are major privacy issues. We don't want to be reactionary and close it off. From your experience, what advice do you have?
Specifically on privacy and ethics?
The misuse and ethical issue, yeah.
I think there are few institutions in the society better equipped to grapple with this, right? This is a forward-looking thing. Higher educational institutions are by nature interdisciplinary, at least as a collective. People don't always talk to each other, but we need to talk to each other. And so, you know, we have departments of philosophy, you know, we have departments of ethics, we have departments of computer science and engineering. People ought to get together and grapple with these topics. You know, I've always spent my academic career betwixt and between departments. I think that's where the interesting stuff happens many times, and I think this is a perfect case of that.
So sexy data scientists and sexy philosophers.
Should get together.
Yes.
And reproduce in large numbers.
Under data-driven guidance. Okay, so we have a question over here.
Socks and sticks or socks and steps?
I think there's a third alternative, isn't there? Well, I think the Cardinals just got to Boston. I don't know if you saw the paper this morning, but I think they had a 7-hour delay on the tarmac yesterday in St. Louis trying to leave. So we'll see.
We have to build that into the data analysis.
An interesting point. While I was coming here this morning, I was reading a roaring discussion online on whether the Red Sox manager made the correct move in Game 5, leaving his pitcher in to bat in the 7th inning, John Lester, or whether he should have taken him out for a pinch hitter. And it was all, again, data-driven points on what the run expectancy was if Lester stayed in, a very poor hitter. In fact, he's never had a hit. Or what it would be, but you would lose his ability to pitch then the subsequent 7th and 8th innings. Again, one with reasoned arguments on both sides, but one which the manager in charge at the moment of making that decision had about 3 or 4 minutes to preview the decision, and then when the situation actually arose, had to make his decision like that. So it's another case of how much information a human could process at the time, and in his seat of the pants way, trying to come out with an assessment of whether he was better leaving his best pitcher in the game or taking him out for a chance to get more runs with men on base. I think it'll be 7.
So the Red Sox fans probably want to end on that note. But one more question, and then we'll close. Yep. You have the mics around the corners here. Here we go.
I'm going to build on a bunch of things that you said and start out by defending calculus. I think we should take calculus for the same reason we should read Shakespeare or Keats. It's as beautiful as anything that we've done. But the real question below that is, what does a person that have to make decisions need to have a gut feeling that's going to guide them well with this plethora of data that's going to be pushed at them? Because it's instinct partly that you're going to be going on. What tools do we need?
First of all, I love calculus. Speaking of Shakespeare, that was meant for rhetorical effect and to get people excited about calculus, about the prospect of getting rid of it. Look, the tools really are, a basic numeracy, an understanding of, and I'm going to say statistics, right? It's not necessarily ANOVA and t-tests and everything else, but the principles behind statistics. The same kinds of things that you love about that you learned when you learned calculus. The same types of learning you learn when you learn about statistics. And I think those types of techniques are important. That type of thinking, learning to think, is really important. And then coupling that with domain knowledge wherever you need to make a decision. And then there are these sets of techniques from computer science, which I think, again, you don't need to know how to program them, but you need to understand, what is Watson doing behind the scenes, et cetera, so that you can decide, look, is that a good use of that set of techniques that a computer might be doing? Those are the kinds of skills that I think, and then the communications and visualization or convincing people, storytelling skills. That's a portfolio of things that I think will stand people in good stead. Whether or not you're teaching or actually learning on both sides.
Steve or Rebecca, did you want to offer a closing comment on that?
I agree. I think it's critical thinking and logic. And because ultimately, I think these big data systems that are being developed, like the Watson system, are uber filtering systems. Basically, what they're going to do is they're going to take all the cumulative data, like I'll use the ER as an example. A patient comes in and you're loading in everything that's known about that patient. It's a mission critical situation. And somebody who just knows English is basically giving all the information to Watson. Watson is then coming back and saying it's 98% this, 72%, 33% on all the way down. But here's what I think is the more valuable contribution. Watson will say, but if you got me this, this, and this data in this order, my diagnosis would go up 20%. It would be 20% more accurate. So suddenly it evens the playing field. You're not dependent on having gotten the smartest person in the ER or the dumbest person in the ER, least competent. It doesn't matter who you get. You go in, and Watson now is going to come back. And it's going to help that person to know what information, what data is the most critical to go get next from the patient in order to improve their odds of surviving. And what's interesting about the Watson system, which I'm a big fan of because I've watched it in ER, I've watched it save lives, is that you can go in and you can say, what made you come up with that? You can click and say, on what basis did you decide that this person had this? Now, again, that's that free will. A human has to intervene. And you need to have critical thinking and logic and that kind of capability in order to look at that and say, oh, yeah, that study, no, that was junk science. That was all written about in the newspaper. So let's eliminate that. Watson, eliminate that study. Now what are your probabilities? So there's a lot of things that can happen. You're still interacting. I call this computer-assisted decision-making, right? I like the idea that we're looking at big data as assisting us in making the best judgment and the best decision, but not completely this idea that we're turning it over and abandoning our own brains and our own sensibility, our own ability to look ahead and do what is best.
Sorry, take another bite at the apple. Sure. In addition to the things that we should learn, I think the other things that we should learn is stuff that we're actually not that great at. So, behavioral economics, the Danny Kahneman thinking slow, thinking fast type of stuff, nudge, Freakonomics. I mean, just understanding what our natural and repeated biases are, cognitive biases are important, so that we can self-diagnose, self-scout when we're actually going to make a mistake in decision making.
Can I end on a funny story?
Maybe save it unless
Oh, okay.
Steve wants to
sorry.
say
Yeah,
something, then
Steve.
we'll end with your funny
Yeah,
story.
it's just a funny story about
I don't
those
have a funny
biases.
story.
He's deferring to your
No,
funny story.
I had somebody come up and say, I don't really believe we have any biases. I think that it's all going to be a data-driven world and everything. And they came up and he said, all this evolution stuff you bring up, it's not really real. And I said, okay, when I thought about it for a moment, and I said, do you go to the grocery store and shop? And he goes, yeah. And I said, well, look, let me save you a lot of time. I don't want you going up and down all the aisles and having to pick everything out. Just go to the checkout line and shop out of other people's carts. They have everything you need. Milk, bread, all that stuff, and they haven't paid for it yet. It's not theirs. So just go shop out of their cart. Why are you going to go up and down? And he goes, I'm not going to do that. And I go, why? What's going to happen? You're not stealing. And he says, well, they'll get mad. They'll call the manager. And I go, what's he going to do? You haven't stolen. Those are those weird biases, those Paleolithic emotions. Right? You haven't done anything wrong technically, but you know that you're not supposed to do that. Well, why? Because territory used to represent our survival. Right? That a troop would defend their territory because all the food and water we needed to stay alive was within that territory. But today, oddly, in this weird, convoluted way, the territory is our basket at the grocery store. So you put your hand even near my basket, I'm going, what are you doing? What are you doing? Get out of my basket. I don't own the basket nor the food in it. So we just have to sort of be a little bit aware of this. I run into this all the time in corporations where you got all the data, you got all the information, and you just can't make headway.
Right.
You want to make change and a whole committee's overruling you and you can't understand it. Those irrational things, I think. We just want to make an accommodation for remember the grocery store and shopping out of people's cars.
I think we're going to remember that. So thanks so much to our panelists. This has been a great discussion.
Sorry,
I have
Steve,
to turn
don't
this
mean
off
to.
so I can talk.